Welcome. Let's discuss how we can solve absolute value equation. Let's start by reminding ourselves of a key property of absolute values. The outcome of an absolute value is always positive. So let's give some examples. If we would have taken the absolute value of 3, that's equivalent to 3. But also, if we would have taken the absolute value of -3, it is also 3. Regardless of what we put inside the absolute value, if it's positive or negative, the output is always positive. So now let's take a look at the equation that we're interested on. We want to see when is the absolute value of 3 times x equivalent to 15. There are 2 cases that we need to consider. We know that if we would have taken the absolute value of positive 15, that is equivalent to 15, which is what we're looking for. But also, if we would have taken the absolute value of -15, that is also 15, which is what we're looking for. So to solve for this equation, we have to solve for both cases, where the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to positive 15, and when the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to -15. So now we have 2 equations to consider. When 3x is equivalent to positive 15, and when 3x is equivalent to -15. And now we solve each one of them independently. On case number 1, if we look at our equation, we can start by dividing by 3, which is going to give us a result of positive 5. So that's our first solution. In the equation in case 2, we can also divide by 3. And it's going to give us a value of -5. So that is our second solution. So the equation that we were given has 2 solutions, the solution at positive 5 and the solution at -5. But now let's check if this makes sense. Let's check our solutions. Let's get the equation that we were given and let's plug in the value of 5 and let's see what happens. Then on the inside of the absolute value, we will get 3 times 5, which is 15. And the absolute value of 15, it is positive 15. So our solution checks. But what would happen if we plug in -5 in the equation? Now on the inside of the absolute value, we will get -15. And the absolute value of -15 is also 15. So our solution checked. So to solve for equations where absolute values are involved, we always have to set it equal to the positive and the negative of what the absolute value is equivalent to, which in this case was 15. Let's take a look at another example. In our second example, we want to solve for the absolute value of 2x minus 11 is equivalent to positive 11. We have to consider 2 cases that will make the absolute value equivalent to positive 11. And the first case is when the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to positive 11. And the second case is when the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to -11. Because if we take the absolute value of 11, that's equivalent to 11. That's what we are saying here. And the absolute value of -11, it's equivalent to also 11, which is what we're saying here. And now we solve each equation individually. Let's look at the equation in case 1. Let's start by adding 11 to both sides. And now let's divide it by -2. So our first solution is when x is equivalent to -11. And now in the equation in case 2, let's add 11. And now let's divide it by -2. So our second solution is when x is equivalent to 0. So we have solved for our equation. Let's take a look at another example. In our third example, notice that the equation, it looks a little bit different than the previous 2 equations that we have solved. The absolute value, it's not by itself. Notice that on the left-hand side of the equation, we have the absolute value, and then we're subtracting a 5 as well. So before we consider the 2 cases as we have done previously, we have to make sure that the absolute value is by itself. So if we take a look at the left-hand side of the equation, there are two terms, the absolute value and the -5. So if we want to let the absolute value be by itself, then we need to get rid of that -5. Let's do that by adding 5 to both sides. And now we're done. Notice that the absolute value is by itself, and now we know that it's equivalent to +7. Now we can consider the two cases. The first case is when the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to +7. And the second case is when the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to -7. On the first case, we are considering the absolute value of 7 as being equal to 7. And the second case, we are considering the absolute value of -7, which also gives us 7. And now we solve each equation. The equation in case 1, let's subtract 8 to both sides. So our solution is that x is equivalent to -1. And the equation in case 2, let's subtract 8 as well. Our second solution is that x is equivalent to -15. So now let's write down our conclusion. There are two solutions when x is equivalent to -1 and when x is equivalent to -15. Let's take a look at another example. In this example, notice that the absolute value, it's not by itself. The absolute value is being multiplied by -5. So before we consider those cases, we need to make sure that the absolute value is by itself. So we need to think of ways of canceling that -5. But we know that the -5 is multiplied, so we need to do the opposite, which is division. So let's get our equation and let's divide by -5 on both sides. On the left-hand side, the -5s are going to cancel out. And on the right-hand side, we're going to get 23. And now we're good, because notice that the absolute value is by itself. Now we can consider the two cases. The first case is when the inside is +23. And the second case is when the inside is equivalent to -23. Because remember that the absolute value of 23 is equivalent to 23, which is what we're saying here. And the absolute value of -23 is also 23, which is what we're saying here. And now we solve each case. Let's start by solving the equation in case number 1. Let's subtract 3 to both sides. That is going to give me 20. And now to solve for x, let's divide it by 4. So now we have our first solution. X is equivalent to 5. Now let's obtain our second solution by solving the equation in case 2. Let's start by subtracting 3 to both sides. That is going to give me -26. And now to solve for x, let's divide it by 4. So now we have that x is equivalent to -6.5. So now let's write our conclusion. There are two solutions. At the value of x equals 5 and at the value of -6.5. Let's take a look at the following example. So here we have the same problem as the example before. Notice that the absolute value, it's not by itself. Here we are subtracting 9, and we're also multiplying by 6. So before we consider both cases, we have to eliminate the -5, and we have to eliminate the 6. Let's start by eliminating the 9. Let's add 9 to both sides. And we almost have the absolute value by itself. We still need to get rid of the +6, which is multiplying. So let's do the opposite. Let's divide it by 6 to eliminate it. So after dividing by 6 on both sides, now the absolute value is by itself. And on the right-hand side, 66 divided by 6, that's 11. Now we're good. Because now notice that the absolute value is by itself. Now we can consider both cases. The first case is when the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to +11. And the second case is when the inside of the absolute value is equivalent to -11. In the first case, we're considering the scenario of the absolute value of positive 11, which is 11. In the second scenario, we're considering when the inside of the absolute value is negative 11, which is also 11. Now we solve each one of them independently. Let's look at the case number 1. To solve for x, let's start by subtracting 1 to both sides. So now the equation is equivalent to 10. So to solve for x, let's divide it by negative 5. So here we have our first solution. X is equivalent to negative 2. Now let's solve for the second solution by looking at the equation on case number 2. To solve for x, let's start by subtracting 1 to both sides. So now the equation is equivalent to negative 12. To solve for x, let's get rid of the negative 5. Let's do that by dividing by negative 5 to both sides. So now we have our second solution when x is equivalent to 2.4. Hello. If you would like to continue learning about mathematics, you can check out the videos on the left.